In this video, we're going to talk about how to configure the FortiGate to use Cisco Duo for authentication with a remote access IPSec IKEv2 VPN. Here, you can see that the FortiGate is in a pretty vanilla configuration, but at the conclusion of this video, we will have VPN authentication working with Cisco Duo. Following these steps, one should be able to get a simple configuration up and running within 30 minutes. Follow along for more information on how to accomplish this in your environment. Let's get started in Cisco Duo. We'll first check the users and validate there are no users present in this solution. As you can see, no users. So let's fix that. In an enterprise environment, there is typically a single source of truth for your user identities. In this case, we will be connecting Duo to Microsoft Entra ID. Duo makes this easy. Select external directories, add external directory, select Microsoft Entra ID, add new connection, hit continue. We will now be prompted for an account that has privileges to auto-provision the access Duo needs to connect to Entra ID. Once we consent to this access, Cisco Duo is connected and able to immediately pull information from Entra ID. As you can see, it knows about the security groups I have defined in Entra. One thing to point out is this option to normalize usernames. This is important because it allows for users to match the username portion of their user principal name, even if they do not include the domain part in Cisco Duo. Also, user aliases might be helpful if you are in a hybrid environment where you are syncing legacy account names, such as SAM account name, instead of user principal name. The remaining defaults can be selected and click Complete Setup. Now keep in mind, completing the directory sync does not automatically synchronize the users into Duo as shown here. To kick off this process, we need to go back to external directories, select our directory, and then click Sync Now. Now we can see that our test user Raymond James has been synced to Duo. The next step is to create the application that will be used to connect Duo and the FortiGate. To do this, click Add Application, search for the Fortinet FortiGate application, and then click Add. After the application is added in Duo, we can update the settings needed for it to interact with the FortiGate. Keeping in mind, this is a SAML-based authentication, so there is no direct connection needed between the FortiGate and Cisco Duo. All communication will be brokered through the end user's browser. Now we head back to the FortiGate to create the corresponding single sign-on object. First, I need to identify the destination for the initial SAML request. In production, this will typically be an FQDN, but since this is a lab, I am using the IP address of my FortiGate. Once I have this, I specify it as the address on port 1001, which is the default port the FortiGate listens for SAML on an IPSec IKEv2 connection. Then select Custom as the type of identity provider and fill in the corresponding information from Cisco Duo. You match the entity ID with the entity ID, the ACS URL with the IDP single sign-on URL, and then lastly, the single logout service for the IDP single logout URL on the FortiGate. Now we need to add the certificate from Duo that the FortiGate uses to validate the assertion. Download the certificate from Cisco Duo, upload that certificate to the FortiGate, and be sure to select that new entry. Lastly, add the attribute claim names for the FortiGate to use from the SAML assertion. On the Duo side, we need to copy the corresponding FortiGate configuration. First, the entity ID, and then the assertion consumer service URL, we define a group membership attribute and marry that with the corresponding security group from Entra ID. Keeping in mind, we do have the ability to define custom SAML attributes, but that is not needed in this case. Click Save, and we are done. Next step is to update Cisco Duo to leverage Entra ID as an external authentication source, so it will do the initial authentication from Entra and then complete the MFA part from Duo. To do this, we will need to configure Entra as a SAML identity provider that Cisco Duo will use. This configuration will be facilitated through the use of the Entra ID management portal to create a corresponding enterprise application for Cisco Duo. First, we create a new application. In this case, we will call it Duo SSO and click Create. Once the application has been created, we then assign users and/or groups to the application. In this case, we will be reusing the sent users group as we defined in Duo. Next, we configure the single sign-on configuration. This is very similar to what we did between the FortiGate and Cisco Duo. We define the entity ID and the assertion consumer service URL as taken directly from Cisco Duo. Once we have those items, we click Save, and we can move on to the next step. Now, one important piece is that we need to make sure the assertions from Entra ID come back in the format expected by Duo. So we add those corresponding assertion claims. The first is email, then username, then first name, then last name, and lastly, display name. Now, as a bonus step, we also add a group claim, even though it doesn't state that in the documentation, but we just do that for completeness sake. From there, we add the corresponding information from Cisco Duo, from Entra ID, certificate included, and once we've added that, we click Save and Enable. The next step is to create a routing rule. So this will tell Cisco Duo what type of authentication to use with the corresponding application. We add the routing rule, give it a name, then we select our application. We select our authentication source and then click Save. Now we have Cisco Duo configured to do the initial authentication to Entra ID. To the FortiGate, we need to create the IKEv2 IPSec tunnel used for the FortiClient VPN connections. In this case, we are not going to use a wizard, rather than use a custom template to have full control over all settings. Here, we give the tunnel a name, we select Dial-Up User, and choose the parent interface the VPN will be established over. We enable mode config and assign the parameters associated with that setting. We leave the advanced network settings at their default, and then we move to the authentication settings. Now, we need to pay special attention to this configuration. For the initial authentication method, we select pre-shared key, although certificates can be used if you select the option for signature. We make sure IKE version 2 is selected, and we enable the EAP setting. A key configuration point to this is that we make sure that we have EAP identity request selected and the user group is set to inherit from policy. As a side note, the main difference between inherit from policy and specifying the user group as part of the phase 1 authentication is that the former, inheriting the policy, allows you to have different levels of access through the same VPN, differentiated by multiple groups that the user is part of as referenced in the firewall policy. If you choose to specify the user group, then all users who authenticate through that VPN will have the same level of access based on that user group membership, regardless of any other groups that the user may be part of. In my experience, it is almost always preferable to use inherit from policy rather than specifying the group in the phase 1 authentication. Next, we eliminate some of the unused encryption and authentication schemes to keep things simple and create the corresponding phase 2 settings. We give it a name and eliminate the unused encryption and authentication schemes again, and then we keep the remainder of the default settings. We select OK, and then OK once again to save the configuration. We can now create the group used for VPN authentication that will be referenced in firewall rules. This group uses the dual single sign-on object we created earlier. Now we create the corresponding firewall rules that will reference the groups in the VPN interface. Please note that the user group needs to be specified in the firewall rule. Otherwise, the user will not be able to authenticate to the VPN. Also note, multiple groups can be specified in a single rule only if they are part of the same authentication source. If there is a need to authenticate different users from different authentication sources, they must be specified in different rules. You will notice that 2 rules are being created. One is for internet access, which has the NAT enabled. The second one is for inside access, and it has NAT disabled. In both cases, the user group is specified in each rule. The next step is to add the single sign-on object that will be used for SAML authentication associated with VPN interface. Please note this is a CLI-only object setting. This object should be tied to the parent interface of the VPN, which in this case is port 2. We have completed the settings needed for the FortiGate. Now let's configure the FortiClient. In the FortiClient, we specify the corresponding settings, taking special care to enable the single sign-on option and specify the port used by the FortiGate for that request. We match the remainder of the phase 1 and phase 2 settings. Then we click Save. From there, let's make our attempt to connect to the VPN. Once the initial connection is established, a pop-up window from the FortiClient will start the SIM authentication process. As you can see, we enter our username in Duo, and then we're immediately redirected to Microsoft Entra. After successfully authenticating the Microsoft Entra, we are redirected back to Duo to do our multi-factor authentication process. Now, because this is the first time this user has actually used Duo, they can actually set up their device as part of this process. Once the device has been set up, we can complete the multi-factor authentication process by acknowledging the push coming from Duo. At this point, the VPN is connected, and we can validate this by looking at an IP configuration output and confirming that we received an IP address assigned from our mode config settings as specified in the VPN settings. As a final step, we can go to the FortiGate to confirm the VPN is indeed established. Under the Network IPSec monitor, we see that the VPN is currently connected from our user. We can also see under the matching VPN logs the status change of the VPN as well as the assigned IP address to the VPN user. This concludes the main purpose of this video, which was to show a very basic configuration between Cisco Duo and the FortiGate for IKEv2 IPSec VPNs. I hope that this content was useful, so please leave any feedback that you may have in the comments below. Remember your ABCs. Always be curious. Until next time.
Please hit the subscribe button because this Chick-fil-A is not going to pay for itself.